It is about teamwork, and the project came to me through Gail Ann Hurd, the producer, who was interested in tackling this subject. So you all end up. We made this movie through COVID, and I'm usually literally eyeball to eyeball with the subjects in every moment of things being filmed, and I couldn't do that. I couldn't, for obvious health reasons, be anywhere. So I was dropped in remote, and I had to work with a DP that, I like working with Peter, we've been working together anyway, but who I could trust to, because I'm just I was conducting the interviews, but I was just on a monitor behind camera talking to the subjects, and I knew that there had to be eyeballs on the ground that could actually make stuff. And that sort of went with the subjects too, like in terms of, you and I had talked about these issues offline, and I knew well before we shot, what what your purview was, right? You wouldn't have anything to that.
It also works. It works so well having Peter, who's so personable as a participant in a documentary. It's all about the rapport and having the best junk brought out of the people that are being interviewed, and it worked really well. It was you were missed, but it's I think all of
little talking head box.
I think it's a glorious film.
So also for question for Carrie, I think as a victim's rights attorney, and I think personally I do cybersecurity stuff for journalists and at-risk groups of people, and so I think that the work that you're doing is really, really important. I really appreciate it. So I would love to hear a bit more about how you ended up doing that type of work, and over the years and the cases you worked on, what sort of role have you two played in that?
Sure. I think the most influential sort of part of my path to getting here was that after college, for 5.5 years, I was a case manager for Holocaust survivors, and did everything from take them to hospital appointments to apply for reparations for slave labor. And I got this really weird education into the psychology of a group of people that was, had been traumatized and was dying. And also this idea that with the reparations and restitution that there's money that's given in exchange for suffering. And it's this gross, weird mismatch of it never fits. But it made me interested in law and reparations and suing. Because I do very firmly believe that if somebody hurts you, then they should pay. And so when I through a circuitous path, when I opened my law firm, I started out mostly representing people who were the victims of sexual privacy violations, like revenge porn and sextortion, and their pictures and videos were published all over the internet and in obscure sites for the most part. But it was all very findable because of Google. And so you typed their name into a search engine, into Google, and it would provide URLs to all this stuff. And so, and Google was refusing to remove those links and was really obstinate for many, many years. And I just began seeing them as a major adversary in terms of anybody having any ownership over their own identity. And then ultimately it brought me to Section 230 because I was like, we need to be able to sue these companies. Why can't we? Oh, because there's this law that has been bloated beyond belief that says we can't.
I think that I want to touch on one of the things that you mentioned there, just around the incentive structure for these tech companies, and how there's a lot of focus on the algorithm and how the goal for the companies is to maximize shareholder value, and how the goal to achieve that is to ensure that we spend more time on these platforms and actually view more and more and more of these videos. So like, we also heard Brianna Wu really talk about like these different task forces that like are spun up when something truly horrendous happens, but then these task forces just go absolutely nowhere. And so I think YouTube actually wants to change. And I think a question for you, Carrie, this one came up when we're talking is like, have you seen over the years any sort of meaningful engagement from Google/YouTube?
Yeah, I mean, they used, and I met Brianna for the first time in like 2015 or 2016 at like a Google task force thing, where they were like, oh, but no, those things don't make meaningful difference. I don't believe in these tech companies you can change anything from the inside. I think you have to fight them from the outside. And I think litigation is my mode of combat, because they can't escape it, and for a couple $100, somebody, anybody can sue if for a harm. And there's different ways that we can try to circumvent Section 230, which you all know from that it's the immunity that these tech companies plead when they're sued. They say you can't sue us because Section 230, because everything that we do is actually content that somebody else has created.
Well, I mean, from my perspective on it, just from making the film and just sort of watching the rise of, there's like a language thing going on too that I think is tricky. I mean, I totally agree with what Carrie's saying. And I mean, we come right out, it's sort of the closest thing we have to a thesis, I think, in this whole thing is that, the good news is we'll probably eventually break these companies up like Standard Oil. The bad news is we may all be dead by then. And it's certainly not going to happen within the next probably decade, right? Which means we've got 2024 election to look forward to being a complete shit show. So things are going to get way, 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 way worse before they get better is probably the reality that we're sitting in. And some of that to me is what gets, frustrating for me is the language of the narrative, because I think it's purposefully obtuse, right? Like you and I were talking about this. There's an algorithm does do specific things, right? You can get into litigation around algorithms. It's totally valid. But if all you talk about to the public is the algorithm. It's like all this discourse around AI right now. Like, people just give up because no one knows what the hell you're talking about. And the person talking probably doesn't know what the hell they're talking about. And it becomes this sort of like vague catch-all. And for me, like I had this suspicion when I started working on this, but the more I worked on it, it was just like, the real problems have very little to do with an algorithm, right? Unsurprisingly, they're human issues, they're not technological issues. They're issues of, I mean, YouTube's business model is very old. I mean, it's the same business model that radio had, that newspapers had. It's just an ad-based model that monetizes attraction to the consumer. And that's tricky when you have now the largest information platform on the planet by an order of magnitude, and the influence and the impact of that. When you are monetizing all of that and your shareholders are happy because you're profiting off of that. So for me, it's about trying to get, because there's going to be a long way. I mean, hopefully Carrie will just like knock one of these suckers down one of these days, but I think it's going to be, while that's happening, I think that being able to begin to change the narrative a little bit around this stuff. That's why I think docs are important, whether it's mine or anyone's, where you start to contextualize things for the public, and give them a sense of the human beings behind what's going on, and help them to realize that these are human issues, business issues, capitalist issues, and not really algorithm issues.
I have 2 updates about like the legal battle if people want to know about them.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
cool. Okay, so Google, or like YouTube was the defendant through Google of the first Supreme Court case ever heard on Section 230 just a couple months ago, and it was about the algorithm. It was about whether or not Google's algorithm or YouTube's algorithm was radicalizing extremists. What's that chair? Okay. I was like, what is
I hope that massage is doing its thing.
I was at the argument And there was a fellow representing the plaintiff who had a lot of trouble articulating what an algorithm was to a group of 9 people who are Supreme Court justices who had a lot of trouble understanding what an algorithm was. And the result was that they just decided they were not going to be ruling on this issue. And they punted it back down to the lower court. So and then the other big development is that there's the first ever multi-district litigation against tech platforms is this massive case that just began, and it's against TikTok, Google, Meta, and Snap, and it's all about the whether or not these social media platforms are addicting youth and subjecting them to depression and eating disorders and suicidal ideation and other types of damages by making the product so addictive. And you've got like hundreds of plaintiffs' lawyers who've suddenly realized that, oh, we can sue tech companies the way that we used to sue car manufacturers or Johnson & Johnson.
Yeah. Which is progress.
It's progress.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it'll be interesting to keep an eye on for sure.
Keep an eye on it, yeah.
I'm not keeping track of time, but I do know we're going to open it up for audience questions.
Sure.
Do we have time? Like,
Yeah, we do.
How much
Yeah.
time do we have
Just
left?
give me like a 3-minute warning. Show. I think we're kind of in here on our own, so.
Yeah,
thanks.
it's 9, so I think we've been here 15-ish.
Okay.
Okay.
We got time.
Okay, then I can fire off. I think maybe one last question, and then we can open it up. So I think having for people who have just seen this now, like, what would you love for them to go and do?
Peter, you want to take a stab at that? You lived in the muck and mire of this thing for.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I don't know, share the film and have a conversation and just continue to look at everything that's around you that's affecting the way we look and see how we've taken our information and how it's presented to us. I mean, it's incredibly dangerous, and anything that we do, we have to sort of take it with a grain of salt, because we have to look at whether or not we're the product, or every time we interact with any of these platforms, and are you the person being taken advantage of, or are you taking advantage of the opportunity of the product? So that might be a convoluted way to say things, but I think please be aware of the dangers of all this stuff and talk to everyone about it, because it's a conversation I have with my kids daily about how addictive it is and how dangerous it is. So it's important.
I'll go and then I'll give it to you, Carrie. I think for me that I bristle a little at the not what Peter said, which I agree with, but at some of the prevailing narratives around technology and the platforms that sort of describe them as an other, right? There's social media, and you just have to get your kids off social media, right? Like, they're on their iPad too much. Tell them to not be on their iPad. Tell them to go outside. Like, when we were kids, we read books, which isn't true. When I was a kid, I watched about 10 hours of Abbott and Costello every day. But I came out okay. There was a lot of match game in there too, but between the two. So it's this whole idea that technology is this other, and you just have to put it down. Anyway, but it's just not reality. And it's not like trying to be hyperbolic to say that technology is just part of our natural ecosystem. It's just a fact. It's just an evolution of human technology and industry and the way we commune with each other. So you often get these there are always people on Zoom yelling about how much they hate technology while they're on Zoom. And not understanding that they'll only be able to talk to each other because of these technologies and these communities. So I think it's really about kind of, like Peter sort of touched on it, I think it's about driving towards the technology in a way as opposed to away from it. And not in this sort of blithe acceptance, but with discernment, but drive towards these things. Don't try to pretend that they don't exist and cut them off. It's not gonna ever work. And I don't even think it's a good thing. I think there's too much value in too many of these things.
Yeah, I mean, all of it's amazing, and I mean, the similar conversation would happen around the time of the printing press, when people were concerned that the average person who could get access to a book would waste all their time reading and wouldn't work. and wouldn't do anything. So if you look back through, history, there's always a moment in time where we're like, well, I don't know, are we gonna be able to get through this? Because now we have books that everyone can read, I mean, like, you look at it and it's,
With those ragged sheets they're putting up in those buildings and projecting stuff on.
exactly, the talkies.
Where it's going, what you want people to.
Well, I agree with Peter that, like, you all should encourage people to watch this movie, which I believe is a great act of resistance. In my opinion, it really hasn't been since World War II that we have an entire industry that is so comfortable with hurting other people. And I think that we should be judging our friends and relatives and ourselves if we're working at some of these places. And we should be judging them harshly.
Nice.
And on that note,
Okay, we have some time for some questions, right, Tiff?
yeah.
Okay.
Do we have a mic, or is it just sort of shout it out?
We can repeat the question.
Yeah.
Just a big fan of Carrie and Al's book. Your book, everybody should pick up Carrie's book. It's just phenomenal.
It's very good, yeah.
Also a fan of Brianna's. But my big question is, YouTube is like the million-channel cable box. It's so hard to pinpoint or say any one thing. I think it's one of the biggest problems that people will have with trying to, Fox News, we see is this. You can get that thing out one thing. Is there any, aside from electing more technologically literate people, is there anything that we can actually, how will the conversation on YouTube change, or do you think, aside from documentaries such as, fine documentaries such as this?
I don't think it's about changing the conversation on YouTube. That's sort of the point of what we just, we really dug into with the film, is that YouTube isn't a social media platform. It isn't a news channel. It isn't an entertainment channel. It isn't a DIY and search channel. It is all of those things. It is the largest portal into all of human recorded history up until and including what's going on in our present that exists on the planet. So that's why, to Carrie's point, the onus has to fall. It has to fall back on the people behind that platform, because otherwise you're literally trying to put the onus on all of humanity, right? And so you can't get away with saying, well, hey, it's just all of humanity. Like, what do you want me to do? The people are shitty, right? It's and I think an interesting, so it doesn't sound glib. Like an interesting recent case was, within the last 2 weeks, YouTube stopped, because they always talk about how hard it is to moderate content, which it is hard to moderate content. It's not easy, but they literally stopped deplatforming all the 2020 big lie content, like right as we're going into an election year, right? So they undid their own content moderation, like within the last 10 days, on one of the most, inciting pieces of propaganda that can create real-world harm and violence as we're moving into an election year with these issues at the forefront, right? Where that's going to be their driving mantra. So, I mean, there's really good examples of I think, like Anthony Padilla says in the film, like, if you've got an intersection without traffic lights, I'm sorry, but you got to put some traffic lights in. And because, to your point, everybody's on the road. Right, so YouTube isn't this car and this car and this car and this car. YouTube is Google. That's who YouTube is, right? So that's where you have to put your focus.
Kind of expanding on the previous question, YouTube is such a vast subject to really tackle, and like you said, it really is a portal. It's a part of everyday life now. So I wanted to ask, how did you approach this project, like pretty much from an initial standpoint, and how did the research process go on this? How did you find all these people? How did you find all these facts? How did that come to be?
Yeah, and that can be kind of a relatively quick answer, because like the thing with any of these docs that we do that are sort of more, that are broadly topical, right? They could be, you don't want to try to swallow the entire ocean. I come from a narrative background, so I approach everything like a story, and it's a narrative. And as Peter was saying, we're you know, you're working in concert with your DP, with your editor all the time, and my research team. But I'm writing all the time. I'm just creating outlines all the time, and what you're doing in that process is you're just focusing the story down and down and down and down and down. You're not trying to tell the whole. The movie's not trying to tell the entire story of YouTube. Really, the only reason we go back and give it the context with Steve Chen and the birth of it is to give you a sense of what a Vertigo-like shift it was when it went from this sort of slightly banal, seemingly sweet, with a couple of bad things going on, to this like rapid ramp up into this huge level of influence and ultimately harms that we get into. So I don't think it was ever our intention to tell, you know, you could make a movie about influencers, you could make a movie just about the kid influencers, you make a movie about so many different corners of it. We were very, very focused on one specific story, which was the way in which people on the planet are influenced by this thing and what's behind this thing. And that was pretty specific. And so going to Carrie, with her reputation and experience, going to Natalie Wynn with hers, the people that we sought out were people that we knew were embedded in YouTube, passionate about it, had a POV, but also had, you know, they'd had death threats, they'd had experiences that were positive and negative, and we wanted them to talk about those. So it wasn't that difficult. I think when Peter and I were working, we were obviously mostly looking to ferret out the emotion in the story, and you know, Peter spent a lot of time with Caleb, and it was like, with that, even the stuff he did with Carrie in New York, like we're always looking to just kind of humanize our core ensemble, but that core ensemble are like superheroes. They all have all of this gold, and so that was sort of the focus, and that's kind of the focus on any of the docs, because you know, most of these stories are giant, and you could spin off in a million directions, and you know, you risk with some audiences, I'm going, well, why didn't you do this, and why didn't you do that? And it's like, well, that's just not, you know, Silence of the Lambs doesn't have a lot of lambs in it. You know, someone's probably pissed off about that. So, we got to wrap up soon. Okay, should we take one more? Let someone else talk.
Kind of going down the rabbit hole of YouTube and looking into doing research for the compulsive approach and also what would be held in the documentary, what to be focused on. What was the most surprising, in a good way, things discovered, but also what was surprising, of course, in bad ways also to find out?
I don't know if anything was like, I mean, you know, there were periods both for you and me and Wes, the editor, where things got pretty dark, right? We were looking at a lot of material, and it's a lot. And especially the years that we were making the film, which was 2019, 2020, and 2021. It was, you know, we all survived it. Some of us didn't, right? It was a lot. So there was a lot of, the things that I knew were good about YouTube remained, actually. Things that I discovered about the incredible effort they made in sort of breaking down barriers for gender, ethnicities, foreign countries, letting influencers get monetized and have a voice. You know, letting a trans influencer really take off, letting many of them take off. That really happened with YouTube intentionally, fair to them, before the entertainment industry picked it up and started their diversity initiatives. I'd say it was driven by the entertainment industry going, oh my God, these YouTube influencers are like bigger than our stable of movie stars. Like, we better start letting some of them have a voice. So there's a lot of good. I mean, we could talk about it it's so big, as the gentleman was saying, it's all of human everything, right? I think one of the shocking things to me that maybe Carrie will think is just super naive is, as much as I know about this stuff, the more I dug into it, the more I realized, it's not that it's a front, because that sounds kind of conspiratorial, but like, YouTube is really just Google's media front end. That's really all it is. But it's presented as a separate company with a separate campus and a separate ideology, and I think once you get your head around the monopoly power of this company and what it's got its hands on, that was fairly chilling, and that's sort of what drove me to, I literally started sending crews. All that stuff at the end was shot by us, like everywhere in the world where those data centers are, we shot all that. You know, it's like not pulled off of YouTube or archival. And I started sending cameras all over the world. I was like, I want to see every fucking data center on the planet. And Wes and I would get this footage back. We'd just be like, holy crap, right? Like, it just blew our minds. So, you know, it's an enormous amount of information, and it's getting bigger all the time. And like Carrie's point at the end, it's like, when is there a tipping point where they've got a leg up on basically anyone else that you want to have this information.
I mean, they may already have, I mean, at this point. I mean, I live outside DC, and it's a major data center growing point in like Northern Virginia. You just, everywhere you go, out in a certain area, you see a brand new data center being built every quarter mile. I mean, there's just hundreds of them being built it's mind blowing. I mean, I don't even understand how they generate the power for them, to be honest with you.
So unfortunately, I have to do another Q&A because we have another audience on another theater. So we're gonna have to wrap it up, and I can't thank you guys enough. And I have, and if you don't care, don't worry, our feelings will not be hurt, but I have some really amazing collectible posters, not many of them, that the lead designer from Mondo, Alan Hines, made for us that are letterpress. They're beautiful. And I only have like 10 of them signed. And if anyone really likes that kind of thing, come down and I'll give you one. And if you're like, I really don't want one, please don't think I'm gonna care, because I really won't. Because we have a lot of movie theaters that we're going to, and I will get rid of them all. But if you want, come down and get them. But thank you so much for coming.